This is part 2, starting on page 9 of the report. Use of constitutionally excessive force. Our review of investigative files for all deadly force causes from 2010 until May 1st, 2016, and a random sample of over 800 non-deadly force cases revealed that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of excessive force. Deficiencies in BPD's policies, training, and oversight of officers' force incidents have led to the pattern or practice of excessive force that we observed. We identified several recurring issues with BPD's use of force. First, BPD uses overly aggressive tactics that unnecessarily escalate encounters, increase tensions, and lead to unnecessary force, and fails to de-escalate encounters when it would be reasonable to do so. Officers frequently resort to physical force when the subject does not immediately respond to verbal commands, even where the subject poses no imminent threat to the officer or others. These tactics result from BPD's training and guidance. Second, BPD uses excessive force against individuals with mental health disabilities or in crisis. Due to a lack of training and improper tactics, BPD officers end up in unnecessarily violent confrontations with these vulnerable individuals. BPD provides less effective services to people with mental illness and intellectual disabilities by failing to account for these disabilities in officers' law enforcement actions, leading to unnecessary and excessive force being used against them. BPD has failed to make reasonable modifications in its policies, practices, and procedures to avoid discriminating against people with mental illness and intellectual disabilities. Third, BPD uses unreasonable force against juveniles. These incidents arise from BPD's failure to use widely accepted tactics for communicating and interacting with youth. Instead, officers interacting with youth rely on the same aggressive tactics they use with adults, leading to unnecessary conflict. Fourth, BPD uses unreasonable force against people who present little or no threat to officers or others. Specifically, BPD uses excessive force against individuals who are already restrained and under officers' control. Does that remind anybody about a situation in Baton Rouge? And 2, individuals who are fleeing from officers and are not suspected of serious criminal offenses. Mind anybody of somebody getting shot in the back down in South Carolina? Force used on restrained individuals. We found many examples of BPD officers using unreasonable force on individuals who were restrained and no longer posed a threat to officers or the public, like people that are handcuffed in the back seat of a police car getting their butt whooped. Force used on fleeing suspects. BPD officers frequently engage in foot pursuits of individuals, even where the fleeing individuals are not suspected of violent crimes. BPD's foot pursuit tactics endanger officers and the community and frequently lead to officers using excessive force on fleeing suspects who pose minimal threat. BPD's aggressive approach to foot pursuits extends to flight in vehicles. Was that in reference to a 18-year-old in Chicago who had stolen a car, exited the car, ran, and got shot in the back? All right, here's the Freddie Gray part. We also examined BPD's transportation of detainees, but were unable to make a finding due to a lack of available data. We were unable to secure reliable records from either BPD or the jail regarding injuries sustained during transport or any recordings. Nevertheless, we found evidence that BPD routinely fails to properly secure arrestees in transport vehicles, needs to continue to update its transport equipment to protect arrestees during transport, and fails to keep necessary records. Number 4, must implement more robust auditing and monitoring systems to ensure that its transport policies and training are followed. Okay, well, that's a little late for Freddie Gray. Our concerns about BPD's use of excessive force are compounded by BPD's ineffective oversight of its use of force. Of the 2,818 force incidents that BPD recorded in a nearly 6-year period we reviewed, BPD investigated only 10 incidents based on concerns identified through its internal review. Of these 10 cases, BPD found only one use of force to be excessive. Yeah, I'm really going to believe that. Retaliation for activities protected by the First Amendment. This is page 10, by the way. BPD violates the First Amendment by retaliating against individuals engaged in constitutionally protected activities. Officers frequently detain and arrest members of the public for engaging in speech and officers perceived to be critical or disrespectful. And BPD officers use force against members of the public who are engaging in protected speech. BPD has failed to provide officers with sufficient guidance and oversight regarding their interaction with individuals that implicate First Amendment protections, leading to the violations we observed. Indication of gender bias in sexual assault investigation. Although we do not at this time find reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in gender-based policing in violation of federal law, the allegations we received during the investigations along with our review of BPD files suggest that gender bias may be affecting BPD's handling of sexual assault cases. We found indications that officers failed to meaningfully investigate reports of sexual assault, particularly for assaults involving women with additional vulnerabilities, such as those who are involved in the sex trade. Detectives failed to develop and resolve preliminary investigations, failed to identify and collect evidence to corroborate victims' accounts, inadequately document their investigative steps, failed to collect and assess data, and report and classify reports of sexual assault, and lack supervisory review. We also have concerns that officers' interactions with women victims of sexual assault and with transgender individuals display unlawful gender bias. Deficient policies, training, supervision, and accountability. BPD's systematic constitutional and statutory violations are rooted in structural failures. BPD fails to use adequate policies, training, supervision, data collection, analysis, and accountability systems, has not engaged adequately with the community it polices, and does not provide its officers with the tools needed to police effectively. BPD lacks meaningful accountability systems to deter misconduct. The department does not consistently classify, investigate, adjudicate, and document complaints of misconduct according to its own policies and accepted law enforcement standards. Instead, we found that BPD personnel discourage complaints from being filed, misclassified complaints to minimize their apparent severity, and conduct little or no investigation. As a result, a resistance to accountability persists throughout much of BPD, and many officers are reluctant to report misconduct for fear of doing so is fruitless and may provoke retaliation. The department also lacks adequate civilian oversight. Its civilian review board is hampered by inadequate resources, and the agency's internal affairs and disciplinary process lacks transparency. Nor does BPD employ effective community policing strategies. The department's current relationship with certain Baltimore communities is broken. As noted above, some community members believe that the department operates as if there were two Baltimores, in which the affluent sections of the city receive better services than its impoverished and minority neighborhoods. This fractured relationship exists in part because of the department's legacy of zero-tolerance enforcement, the failure of many BPD officers to implement community policing principles, and the department's lack of vision for engaging with the community. BPD fails to adequately supervise officers through policy guidance and training. Until recently, BPD lacked sufficient policy guidance in critical areas such as bias-free policing and officers' use of batons and tasers. In other areas, such as its policy governing stop and frisk, BPD policy conflicts with constitutional requirements. The department likewise lacks effective training on important areas such as scenario-based training for use of force. Tamir Rice, ring a bell? An adequate field training program and supervisory or leadership training. BPD also fails to collect data on a range of law enforcement actions, and even when it collects data, it fails to store it in systems that are capable of effective tracking and analysis. Partly as a result, the BPD does not use an effective early intervention system to detect officers who may benefit from additional training or guidance to ensure that they do not commit constitutional and statutory violations. It also doesn't help to be able to use the compiled data to dismiss officers that are pieces of crap. But, let me continue. In addition, BPD fails to adequately support its officers with adequate staffing and material resources. The department lacks effective strategies for staffing, recruitment, and retention, forcing officers to work overtime after long shifts, lowering morale, and leading to officers working with deteriorated decision-making skills. Moreover, BPD lacks adequate technology infrastructure and tools that are common in many similar-sized law enforcement agencies, such as in-car computers. These technological deficits create inefficiencies for officers and inhibit effective data collection and supervision. The city must invest in its police department to ensure that officers have the tools they need to properly serve the people of Baltimore. Now, I'm going to jump here because there's a bunch of stuff that I'm not really all that interested in, so hang on a second. Okay, I jumped through one entire section that had the history of Baltimore, the history of the police department, that kind of stuff. If you're interested, and again, I invite you to pull up the full report yourself and read it at your leisure. Now, it's going to take you a while because I'm telling you, it took me a while to read the thing, and that's why I'm trying to give it to you in 20-minute clips. And then you can, if you can write down or print out the table of contents at the beginning of each video, as I indicated, I'm going to tell you where I start and try to tell you what page number it's from. Okay, here we go. The BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the United States Constitution and laws, and conduct that raises serious concerns. Okay, this is a section of, I'm not going to say it's gobbledygook because it is important, but it's a section that indicates all of the laws that were violated, period. So I just made note of that, and I'm going to skip past all of the legalese for you. Our investigation finds that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that implicates our statutory authority. This pattern or practice is rooted in BPD's deficient supervision and oversight of officer activity, leading directly to a broad spectrum of constitutional and statutory violations. This lack of supervision and oversight includes BPD's failure to use effective and widely accepted methods to supervise officers, collect and analyze data on officer activity, and classify, investigate, and resolve complaints of misconduct. This pattern or practice also manifested in several ways that violate specific constitutional and statutory provisions. BPD stops searches and arrests individuals on Baltimore streets without the reasonable suspicion or probable cause required by the Fourth Amendment. 2. BPD disproportionately stops searches and arrests African Americans in violation of Title VI and the Safe Streets Act. And this disparate impact, along with evidence suggesting intentional discrimination against African Americans, exacerbates community distrust of the police. 3. BPD uses unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. 4. BPD violates the First Amendment rights of Baltimore residents by using force or otherwise retaliating against individuals exercising constitutionally protected activities such as public speech and filming police activities. 5. BPD's use of force against individuals with mental health disabilities or existing crisis violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. To illustrate these violations, throughout this letter we provide several examples of each type of violation that we found during our investigation. In some sections, we provide more examples to illustrate the variety of circumstances in which the violation occurred, while in others we focus on one or two examples that demonstrate the nature of the violations we found. The number of examples included in a particular section is not indicative of the number of violations we found. These examples comprise a small subset of the total number of incidents upon which we based our conclusions. We make these findings after a comprehensive 14-month investigation into BPD's practices. To gain the broadest possible perspective on the challenges facing BPD, our investigation involved reviewing an exhaustive set of documents and meeting with hundreds of officers, community members, city leaders, and other stakeholders. In total, we reviewed hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, including all relevant policies and training materials used by the department since 2010. BPD's database of internal affairs files, a random sample of about 800 case files on non-deadly force incidents, files on all deadly force incidents since 2010 that BPD was able to produce to us through May 1st, 2016, a sample of several hundred incident reports describing stops, searches, and arrests, investigative files on sexual assault cases, databases maintained by BPD and the state of Maryland containing information on hundreds of thousands of pedestrian stops, vehicle stops, and arrests, and many others. Throughout our review, we were assisted by a dozen law enforcement experts from across the country with expertise on the issues we investigated. Okay, there was more, but I jumped to page 25. BPD makes unconstitutional stop, searches, and arrests. We find that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making stop, searches, and arrests in violation of the 4th and 14th Amendment and Section 14141, period. BPD frequently makes investigative stops without reasonable suspicion of people who are lawfully present on Baltimore streets. During stops, officers commonly conduct weapons frisks or more evasive searches, despite lacking reasonable suspicion that the subject of the search is armed. These practices escalate street encounters and contribute to officers making arrests without probable cause, often for discretionary misdemeanor offenses like disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, loitering, trespassing, or failure to obey. Indeed, BPD's own supervisors at Central Booking and prosecutors in the state's attorney office declined to charge more than 11,000 arrests made by BPD officers since 2010. BPD's unconstitutional stop, searches, and arrests result in part from its zero-tolerance enforcement strategy. Now that was pretty long, so I'm going to just point you out to that, and I'm going to skip down to BPD's unconstitutional stops and searches pedestrians. The 4th Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable seizures when they step from their homes onto the public sidewalks. Contrary to this principle, we find reasonable cause to believe that BPD officers regularly stop and search individuals who are lawfully present on Baltimore streets, despite lacking the constitutionally required information that criminal activity is afoot. Our findings are based on statistical analysis of stop outcomes, interviews with officers and community members, complaints filed against BPD, and our review of a random sample of several hundred incident reports that officers completed for arrests that stem from pedestrian stops. Officers' descriptions of the underlying stops in these incident reports reveal frequent constitutional deficiencies. We were unable to systematically analyze the sufficiency of reasonable suspicion in all stops made by BPD officers, as opposed to the subset of stops leading to arrest, because most BPD stop reports do not describe the facts establishing reasonable suspicion for a stop. By limiting our review to stops that resulted in arrest, we focused on cases where officers presumably had stronger facts of criminality to justify a stop compared to stops in which the investigation proved fruitless. It is troubling that this review nonetheless found repeated constitutional violations during stops and searches by BPD officers. Okay, I'm getting close to 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop it here and pick it up in the next video.